Part of this series is we're going to talk about what makes us happy. Now, what makes you happy?
Coffee.
That didn't take long. The Psychology Today asked that question of 52,000 Americans, and here's part of the list of what their answers were. Friends, or social life, having a job, being in love, recognition and success, sex, personal growth, a good financial situation, having a house or an apartment, being attractive or beautiful, my religion, recreation and exercise, being a parent, marriage, and my partner's happiness. What's interesting about that list is that almost all of those are attempts to find happiness through external rather than internal situations. Now, we know we live in a world that very much tries to define happiness as something that we find through a set of circumstances. What I call when and then thinking. When I get out of high school, everything's going to be great and I'm going to be happy. When I get married, I'll be happy. When I get a divorce, then, yeah. When I have children, that's what's going to make me happy. When the children leave the house, that's when I'm going to be happy. And over, it's all about some sort of circumstance that's going to make me happy, and that's when it's going to happen. The problem with that is we know it doesn't work that way because there's always something else. Now, classic chapter found in the Bible that deals with this whole idea is Ecclesiastes 2. And in that, Solomon, the wisest and richest man ever to walk the earth, he said in verse 1, he said, I decided to enjoy myself and find out what happiness is. Now, if you want to save yourself a whole lot of time and trouble, go ahead and read that chapter and figure out what he had to say. He said, I tried it all. He says, I want to let you know there were three things that I found out real quickly that were dead ends. First of all, I want you to know accumulating things was a dead end. He could have anything he wanted. In fact, he was the richest man. He had so much. If he wanted it, he just went and got it. Now, I wish I could say that, we never think like that, but many of us do. We think, if I won the lottery, then I'd be happy. They asked one of the richest men, Howard Hughes, how much money a person needed to be happy, and he said, just a little bit more. Never quite got there. You can't buy happiness. Solomon said, you can also, I tried to experience pleasure in my life. He said, I did all these kinds of things and anything I wanted that made me feel good. I went, had 700 wives. Which, guys, if you're like me, immediately you think 700 mother-in-laws. That's just, he's missing it. But there are people who think it's about the stuff. It's about the symbol and the status and the right brand of clothing and the right vehicle and the right jewelry, which, again, that whole idea that I can do something and it's going to bring happiness. He said, I'm also, this whole idea of achieving success. Now, he was the richest king in all of history, had everything. He was king of, he had even slaves that did anything he wanted, and yet his conclusion in all of that was this verse: all of it is meaningless, chasing after the wind. It's all a waste of time. Now, that's the popular idea, is to say that you can be happy if you have the right circumstances. But God's way to happiness is a little bit different. His way to happiness is that you and I have the right attitude. Now, some of you would think, okay, that's extremely simplistic, because you don't know what's going on in my life. I want to tell you that over the next several weeks, I want us to look at the opening lines of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, his most famous message that he addressed to people, everyday people, just like you and me. And as he did that, realize that they were a nation waiting for the Messiah to show up. They felt oppressed. They dealt with everyday hardships. And so they were looking for freedom, and they were looking for hope. And so many of these people kept thinking, when the Messiah comes, then everything's going to be okay. He's going to fix everything in my life. Again, that whole external idea. And so these people very much understood what the hardships of life were all about. But I want us to notice something. Jesus started his message, the Sermon on the Mount, and he chose the subject, how to be happy. Why? Because he knows that then, just like today, everybody is trying to figure it out. They're searching for happiness, and yet it seems like very few people ever find it. Now, for the next 8 weeks, we're going to look at the 8 Beatitudes, as they're called, or a way how for us to be happy, and not just principles for personal happiness, but for our own emotional health. Now, each one of those begins with blessed, or for some of you, blessed, and it's simply an Old English word that means happy. So whenever it says to blessed is a person, it's happy. So real easily in those Beatitudes, you can read, happy are you if you're poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Happy are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Happy are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Happy are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Happy are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Happy are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Happy are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. Happy are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now you read those and it sounds like, wait a minute, there's a lot of contradictions in there. Happy if you're sad. Happy if you're poor. Happy if you're put down and persecuted. For many of us, doesn't sound like happiness to me. And yet Jesus was saying that you can learn to be happy in spite of your circumstances. If you have to have all of your problems solved in order to be happy, guess what? Not happening. If everything in your life has to be perfect for you to be happy, it's not going to happen. Many of you know my mom has been struggling with osteoporosis to the point where her vertebrae in her back are just breaking on their own. They're so brittle. Lois Ford's suffering from the same thing, but she's been doing it for 2.5, 3 years now. And this past week she went to the doctor, and the doctor pretty much said, this is probably the best you're ever going to be for the rest of your life. Now, you and I know, you hear that kind of news, and for a lot of people, they just want to give up. Last night, we all went out to dinner. She was laughing. She was cutting up. She was walking slow and making fun of herself and just, I'm doing the best I can, you know, just wait on me. And she did the best she could because she has figured out it's not my circumstances that determines my happiness. It's my attitude. It's what's going on the inside. So note that your happiness is not determined by what's going on around you, rather what's going on inside you. It doesn't depend on something outside, and yet for so many of us, we live it's so easy to live this miserable life, and you think that somebody, if they would just do this, or if this would happen, if that would happen, everything would be okay. But you know how we are. I mean, once that may happen, we find another reason. If we really want to find something to complain about, there's always something to complain about. God says, if you want to know happiness, you've got to start right inside you. So as we walk through these different Beatitudes, I want us to note really the first step today is to look at the very first one, and that is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, what does it mean to be poor in spirit? And I will tell you, it does not mean that you have to have low self-esteem. It's not about putting yourself down. It's not about being perfect, because we know better. So what does it mean to be poor in spirit? It simply means that you and I need to depend on God. What we're talking about here is humility. In other words, it's admitting I don't have it all together. I'm not perfect. Now, there are those people, when you talk to them, you would swear they know everything about everything. You would swear that they've got life completely figured out and they don't have any problems. In fact, have you ever met anybody who thinks they know it all? You have, okay. How much fun are they to be around? Yeah. To be around somebody who, no matter what you're going through and you tell your story, they can always one-up you. And even if it's going to the store and buying some cereal, let me tell you what happened when I went to the store to get some cereal. They've always got one more. This is a person who realizes their need for God. You know, the opposite of being poor in spirit is really the idea of arrogance. Good News translation of this passage is, happy are those who know they're spiritually poor. They don't have it figured all out. They're a work in progress. I know my limitations, and I am very humbled by that. Living Bible says, happy are the humble. Point is that Jesus is starting off with today is simply humble and happy go together. So how does my being humble help my happiness? One of the ways is it reduces the stress in my life. When I'm humble, real quickly, I can relax because I don't have all the answers. It's okay to say, I don't know. Now, there's some people, it kills them to be able to say, I don't know. I can resign as the general manager of the universe. I don't have to have all the answers. When I'm humble, I don't have to fake it. I don't have to pretend, because I know I'm not perfect. And I don't have to play God and assume the responsibility that was never meant to be mine. When I'm humble, I can live in that tension between what's ideal, where I would love to have my life, and what I'm striving for, and reality, what's real. And there's always a tension in there, and I realize I'm a work in progress. That God has still got a lot of work to do in my life, and I want Him to continue to make me into the person He wants me to be. So humility accepts the fact that, you can be happy because you're depending on God, even though things aren't ideal. You may not have the best job, you may not have the best marriage, but it's all a work in progress. And so it can reduce some stress in your life. Now, I'm convinced that we take ourselves way too seriously. In fact, I believe we take ourselves too seriously and God not serious enough. And I think that the crux of almost every one of our problems is we're trying to impress people with who we are because of what we know, and it causes all kinds of problems. When I become a humble person, when I walk in dependence and realize I don't have to have it all figured out, and I can trust God to take care of it, there's a lot of stress that is relieved in my life. Second thing that happens is, as a result, oftentimes once you figure that first one out, is it improves your relationships. I asked a moment ago, and many of you raised your hand, or at least made the face. You know what it's like to be around people with big heads, who feel as though they know everything. And if you're like me, prideful people, they're a real pain and a blessed assurance. Nobody likes to be around them. Self-centered people are never happy. And they want you to be as miserable as they are. That they want you to join in their little pity party. But you're around somebody who's humble, who's more interested in you than trying to tell you what's going on in their life. People who are interested in you are more interesting to you very often. We want to be around those kinds of people. And remember, humility doesn't mean to think less of yourself. It just means to think more about other people. So you have better relationships when you're a humble person. You say those two very difficult words a whole lot easier too. I'm sorry. Or those three hard words, I was wrong. Or the other three hard words, I need help. Some of us hate admitting that. But we don't have it all figured out. There are things that you know that I don't. There are things I know that you don't. That's why God created us to be together. That's why we're supposed to be in community. And when I'm poor in spirit, it simply means that I don't have to fake it or pretend that I'm perfect. And it reduces my strength or my stress, and it improves my relationships. I read a story this week about St. Francis of Assisi. And anytime somebody gave him a compliment, he had a way of maintaining his humility. He would go to one of his fellow monks, and they would remind him of all of his shortcomings. Now, he had to ask a monk because he didn't have that person living with him. And some of us, we have that person, and let me just say, ladies, wives, it's not your job to keep your husband humble. Husbands, I know, husbands, it's not your job to keep your wife humble. Love the story that Ruth Graham once told about her husband, Billy Graham. She said, "My job is to love my husband. God's job is to keep him humble." When we're loving one another, we allow God to be able to work in that person a whole lot easier. We need to let God deal with people and do what he has always wanted us to do, and that is simply to love one another. That kind of humility and not taking that role upon yourself is going to improve your relationship. I find that when I'm full of pride, one of the other things is I bruise very easy. Somebody criticizes me and it's the end of the world. And yet, I've learned over the years that when they point out some flaw in my life, and they say, "Do you know what's wrong with you?" And I say, "Let's go through the list." I've got a whole list right here. I've got it. I know I'm not perfect. I know I've got problems. And guess what? So do you. We're all in the same boat. You don't have to fake it. By realizing that you don't have to have it all figured out, a lot of stress goes away in your life. Your relationships are better. One of the other things that I want you to note here is it also releases the power of God in your life. Humility releases God's power. In fact, James 4:6, look at this passage. God gives strength to who? The humble. But he sets himself against the proud. Would you like to have God's strength in your life? The Bible says the secret of finding that kind of spiritual power is to walk humbly before the Lord. To simply realize how much you need God in your life. Shared with the first service, and I'll do that again. Many of you know the last several months have been pretty difficult, especially for Pastor Gary and I. And I'll tell you, in the midst of all of this was Christmas. And, this whole time of joy and just, it was a lot of struggle going on. And one of the things that our church does is they put boxes right outside, and many of you put cards and gifts and just different things in there. And so throughout the weeks leading up to Christmas, I would get a batch of those. And I remember one time, it was in the second week of Advent, that I was opening up the cards and reading some of what you said. And it overwhelmed me at one point and moved me even to tears as I began to realize just how much God has blessed me, and I don't feel like I deserve it. There's so much we take for granted. There's so much we want to point at other places, and I began to think about, just being here, being in America, being in this church, being with this family. And so as I was there and I was reading some of the stuff and the things that were said and thinking about all that stuff, the two things that came to me more than anything else was, first of all, how much God has blessed me, and I feel like I don't deserve any of it. And then the feeling that, you know, the responsibility I have as a pastor, and I know people come and they're expecting to hear something from me, and how overwhelming that can be sometimes. And I realized very quickly how inadequate I am and how much I need God in my life. In the passage, you know, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, came to mind. You know, if you've had one of those times where you yourself have realized just how blessed you are, and you've had those times when you realize just how much you need him in your life for direction and for help, that's the kind of humility he is looking for from his people. That's the secret of happiness, is that surrendering of who you are to God. Because he's always wanted the same thing for all of history from his people. He wants the same thing from you as he does for me. He wants to be our God. He wants us to be his people. Take a look at the Phillips translation of our passage this morning. Happy are those who know their need for God. The kingdom of heaven is theirs. You realize everything that God has to offer is yours if you simply rely upon him. And there's nothing he wouldn't do for someone who's trusting in him. To face whatever you have to face this week. To realize that you don't have to have all the answers. That it doesn't have to be fixed. But you know God has a hand in what's going on. That he's going to give you the strength. And so you're going to trust him in spite of what you see. That's what we need to remember today. Then I was reminded of John 13:17 that says, now that you know the truth, how happy you will be if you put it into practice. See, so much of what I do in sermons is to remind you of what you already know. You know you're supposed to trust God. You know that when you do that, there is a sense of peace that overwhelms us, that is beyond human understanding. So this morning, what area in your life are you facing that you've been trying to handle way too much of? And you need to just let it go and put it into his hands. And when you realize God's in control, and you're going to trust him for that, the stress moves out, the peace comes in. People around you. It improves those relationships. And you begin to see the power of God in your life. So where do you need to depend on God more this week? I want to tell you, if you leave out of here and you don't believe any of this stuff that I'm talking about, when you face whatever you have to face this week, whose power are you going to be doing it in your own? That's why some of you are so exhausted all the time, because you're trying to tackle the problems of the world and you forget you've got a Heavenly Father that wants to help you. He wants to take that. He wants to give you his power. And if you trust him, he will fill you in ways you can only imagine. So as we close our time, let me invite you to bow your heads with me. As we spend this time, I want to encourage you just to think through that area of your life right now that you especially need God's help in. And maybe you would say, God, I'm not making it as a parent. I'm not making it as a partner. I'm not making it as a professional or as a student. Lord, today I admit that I need you in my life. I need your power. I need your guidance. So I want to humble myself before you and admit openly, I don't have it all figured out. There are so many things beyond my control. You ask me to rely upon you, Lord, and that's what I want to do. And so I humble myself and I ask you to fill me with your Spirit. Help me to know what you want me to do. Give me the courage to act and to do what I know I should. And Father, as I go through this week and as I'm tempted to try to take on more and more myself, I ask you by your Holy Spirit to nudge me and to remind me that I don't have to have it all figured out. That you know best. And if I will simply trust you, you have a way of changing everything. And so, Lord, as your people, we humble ourselves before you and we put everything we are and have in your hands. Today, Lord, I thank you for your word. And I look forward to what you're going to continue to teach us through this series. Especially for the reminder today that the foundation of it all is realizing how much we need you in our lives. Lord, thank you for the many times that you have not given up on us, for the way you continue to move in our lives to bring us back to you. And Lord, if there's anyone here today that's never received you, if you're that person here, I want to encourage you just to open your heart right now and just ask God to come in. Because he wants to be your God. He wants to save you from your sins. So receive him today and know the same promises are for all of God's people. Lord, thank you for this message, for what you're doing in our lives. Help us to trust you more. In Jesus' name, and all God's people said, amen.